John Sheedy stepped out his front door at around 8 o'clock on the evening of January 11th, 1891, and walked into an ambush. A man came at him from the shadows, fast, close, no warning. He was carrying a steel cane wrapped in leather, and he used it 3 times against the right side of Sheedy's head. Sheedy didn't go down. He pulled a pistol, and the man dropped the cane and ran south down 12th Street and disappeared into the dark. Mary Sheedy heard it from inside the house. She came out, helped her husband through the door, and sent for a doctor and the police. A neighbor, also a physician, arrived first. The 2 doctors examined the wound together. They dressed the injury, gave Sheedy something for the pain, and told him he was going to be fine. Later that night, Mary gave her husband a sleeping powder and a cup of coffee. Sometime after midnight, John Sheedy lost the use of his limbs. By morning, he was in a coma. He died the following evening, around 10 o'clock, never having regained consciousness. The abandoned cane lay in the street where it had been dropped. Someone retrieved it. It would turn out to be the first solid piece of evidence the police had, and the thing that led them, within 2 days, to a specific name. John Sheedy had arrived in Lincoln in 1869, a young man from Ireland by way of Council Bluffs, Iowa. By 1891, he was one of the most recognized figures in the city. Not because he held office, or built a church, or endowed a hospital, because nearly every man of consequence in Lincoln had, at some point, climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor of Gus Sanders' saloon on the southeast corner of 10th and P Street. That was where Sheedy ran his casino. It offered stud poker, roulette, faro, dice. It operated every evening. It was illegal under Nebraska law, and it had, among its regular clientele, the sitting mayor of Lincoln, Carlos C. Burr, along with enough lawyers, politicians, and businessmen to fill a courthouse, which, as it happened, stood directly across the street. Sheedy maintained his operation through 2 methods. The first was competition. He offered better games at fairer odds than anyone else in the city, and he enforced order at his door with the kind of efficiency that discouraged trouble. The second method was simpler. He paid the Lincoln police a monthly sum, described in court records as rent, to ensure his casino would not be raided while others were. This arrangement created 2 groups of enemies. The gambling competitors he had muscled out of business, and the reformers, a growing faction in Lincoln organized into a law and order league, who were furious not simply that the casino existed, but that it operated in plain sight, half a block from the police station, without consequence. In the years before his death, Sheedy had been arrested repeatedly, fined small amounts, and continued operating. He had been assaulted outside his casino in 1885, again in 1888, and then once more on the night of December 9th, 1890, just a month before the fatal attack, when someone fired a revolver at him from the shadows of his own yard. That December shooting was never solved. Most people in Lincoln assumed it was a rival gambler, or a disgruntled patron, or any number of men Sheedy had made enemies of over the years. They were wrong, but they would not find that out for several weeks. In the meantime, Sheedy had also been building something more respectable. In the mid-1880s, he constructed a 3-story commercial building on P Street, the Sheedy Building, as it came to be known, finished in pressed brick and Buffalo Gap stone, with an elaborate copper cornice along the roofline. He had a home built on 12th and P, a proper house with a fence and an arbor and a trellis along the south wall. He was, in the way of many men of his era and his city, attempting to inhabit two worlds at once: the demimonde of the Uptown district and the respectable middle-class neighborhood 2 blocks to the east. The morning after the attack, a coroner's inquest convened in a jury room overflowing with reporters, lawyers, and police. When the jury voted to meet in secret, the press was incensed. They smelled a cover-up. They were right to be suspicious, though perhaps not for the reasons they imagined. The inquest concluded that John Sheedy had been murdered. Cause of death: internal bleeding from a blow to the head. Several of the jurymen disagreed. The symptoms, they said, looked more like morphine poisoning. Mary Sheety had not always been Mary Sheedy. She had been Molly McCool, then Molly Marital, and she arrived in Lincoln in 1879 as the wife of a man named George Marital, her second husband. Her first husband, Horace McCool, was in prison. She and Marital patronized the saloons and gambling halls of the Uptown district, including, at some point, Sheedy's Casino on the second floor of the Quick Building. Their marriage deteriorated badly. Marital locked her out of their apartment, sold the furniture, and returned to Illinois, leaving her in Lincoln with nothing. She moved in with John Sheedy, and in 1882 she divorced Marital. The circumstances of her life before John Sheedy, 2 failed marriages, a first husband behind bars, a period spent in the bars and casinos of a rough entertainment district, would follow her for the rest of the decade. In Lincoln in 1891, a woman's past was not private. It was evidence. What John Sheedy saw in her, or she in him, is not part of the record. What is recorded is the New Orleans ultimatum. The two of them had traveled south for a vacation, and at some point during the trip, Mary told him plainly, marry her or she would stay. They returned to Lincoln as husband and wife. By the mid-1880s, they were living in the house on 12th and P Street, and by most accounts, including those of neighbors who would later testify, living quietly and respectably. That changed in the summer of 1890. John and Mary traveled to Buffalo, New York, where she received treatment for what newspapers of the time called, with characteristic delicacy, a disease peculiar to women. The couple quarreled. John returned to Lincoln alone. Mary stayed on. In Buffalo, she met Andrew Wallstrom, a machinist and traveling salesman, 10 years her junior. He was attentive in ways that John Sheedy, by 1890, apparently was not. When Mary eventually returned to Lincoln to reconcile with her husband, Wallstrom followed her. John Sheedy showed the man around the city, took him to the new courthouse and the state capitol. Whether he suspected anything is not recorded. By the fall of 1890, there were 3 people living in the orbit of the house on 12th and P Street, and a 4th who came every week, on schedule, to do Mary Sheedy's hair. William McFarland went by Monday. He was a barber and hairdresser who had come to work at a shop just steps from the Sheedy household, Beverly Crampton's barber shop at 930 P Street, directly next door to the Sheedy building. John Sheedy himself went there nearly every day for a shave in the last months of his life. Monday McFarland came to the house once a week to dress Mary Sheedy's hair. What developed from those weekly visits, according to McFarland's eventual confession, was a relationship, and then a conspiracy. Mary had confided in him, he said. Her marriage was a pretense. John had reverted to his old ways, keeping company with other women, spending his nights at the casino. She told McFarland about her affair with Wallstrom, and then, at some point, she made him an offer: $20,000 to kill her husband. The estate, she told him, was worth $200,000. He stood to inherit it all. When he refused, she threatened him. She would tell John about their relationship. McFarland, with no money and no power and no family name that would carry weight in a Lincoln courtroom, agreed. He made 2 attempts in December of 1890, both with a revolver, both unsuccessful. On January 9, 1891, he purchased the leather-covered steel cane from a pawn shop on P Street, owned by a man named Hyman Goldwater. 2 days later, he waited in the shadows beside the house on 12th Street. That is his account. It is the only direct account of a conspiracy that exists. It is the account that drove the entire prosecution, and it is the account that McFarland would, within weeks, retract entirely, claiming he had confessed only because the police had threatened to deliver him to a mob waiting outside the jail. He was the only person in this case with nothing: no estate to inherit, no attorneys on retainer, no brother arriving from Denver with Pinkerton detectives. He gave a confession. He took it back. And in the end, the entire machinery of the law turned on the question of whether what he said in a dark room under threat could be believed. On January 2nd, 1891, 9 days before John Sheedy was attacked, the Nebraska Supreme Court issued a ruling that would become, in retrospect, one of the most consequential facts in this entire case. A murderer, the court held, cannot inherit from his victim. 9 days later, John Sheedy was dead. His estate was estimated at $200,000. In 1891, that was a substantial fortune, enough to buy a city block in Lincoln or to live on comfortably for the rest of a long life. Mary Sheedy, as his wife, stood to inherit it. Unless, of course, she had killed him. John Sheedy's brother Dennis arrived from Denver within days of the murder. He was a wealthy banker, well-connected and well-funded, and he brought with him 2 detectives from the Pinkerton Agency and a team of attorneys to assist the prosecution. He also aligned himself almost immediately with John Fitzgerald, a reform politician who had been one of John Sheedy's most persistent adversaries for years. Together, Dennis Sheedy and Fitzgerald were appointed co-administrators of the estate. The defense would later argue, loudly and at length, that this arrangement explained everything, that the prosecution of Mary Sheedy was not a search for justice, but a calculated effort by Dennis Sheedy to gain control of his brother's estate, with John Fitzgerald providing the political cover. Fitzgerald had spent years trying to shut down Sheedy's casino, and now he was administering the proceeds of it. There is no proof of that. There is also no proof it wasn't true. What is certain is this: by the time the case came to trial, one of the administrators of John Sheedy's estate was also one of the men driving the prosecution of the woman who stood to inherit it. The Nebraska Supreme Court had ruled that a murderer cannot benefit from the murder. John Fitzgerald had a stake in proving Mary was one. In April of 1891, while the trial was being prepared, a fire broke out at the Hotel Mac, which occupied the Sheedy building on P Street. The watchman said an oil lamp had exploded. No trace of the lamp was ever found. No one was charged. What killed John Sheedy is a question that was never definitively answered. The official conclusion of the coroner's inquest was internal bleeding caused by blows to the head. 5 physicians attended Sheedy in the hours before his death, and when the matter came before the district court in March of 1891, the prosecution filed formal charges that included not only the assault but poisoning, alleging that John Sheedy had died from morphine administered by his wife in that cup of coffee. The basis for the poisoning charge was circumstantial, but not unreasonable. The timeline was suspicious. 2 doctors had examined the head wound the night of the attack and found it serious but survivable. By 4 in the morning, Sheedy was paralyzed. By the following evening, he was dead. Paralysis and coma following a head injury are consistent with cerebral hemorrhage. They are also consistent with morphine overdose. Several members of the coroner's jury had said so at the time. The prosecution sent Sheety's stomach to a chemist in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The result arrived in April 1891 as the trial was being prepared. No trace of morphine, no trace of any poison. Sheety's body was then exhumed. His liver, spinal cord, and bladder were removed and sent to Professor Hayes, a toxicologist at Rush Medical College in Chicago, for a second analysis. No poison found. The prosecution still pursued the poisoning theory at trial. Dr. C.S. Hart, the first witness called, testified that Sheety's death was caused by compression of the brain, not poisoning. The physical evidence supported the head injury. The chemical evidence was silent. Mary Sheety had been in that room. She had brought the coffee. Whether that coffee contained anything other than a sleeping powder, a common remedy of the era available without prescription, no laboratory in 2 examinations could establish. The prosecution had a motive. It had a confession naming the wife. What it did not have was poison. Monday McFarland was arrested on January 17, 1891, outside a saloon on P Street. Police Marshal Samuel Mellick had seen him in the neighborhood and brought him in for questioning. A pawnbroker named Hyman Goldwater had already identified the cane. He remembered selling it to McFarland roughly a week before the murder. McFarland's answers were unsatisfactory. He was taken to the city jail. What happened over the next 24 hours would become the central dispute of the entire trial. McFarland was held in a space the newspapers called a sweatbox, a dark, airless cell used for interrogation. Rounds of questioning, hours of pressure. On the night of January 18th, Detective James Malone obtained the confession. When the case came to trial in May, the defense called witnesses to describe what that night had looked like from outside the cell. Former police captain W. W. Carter testified that he had overheard Malone tell McFarland directly, "Confess or be handed over to the mob gathered outside the jail." Officer B. F. Pinillo, a 30-year veteran, described a conversation with Malone in which the detective explained, with apparent satisfaction, how he had induced the statement. A member of the coroner's jury testified to a similar account. The confession itself had been recorded by a stenographer named Myron Wheeler, who had hidden behind a curtain in the jail while McFarland spoke. The complete text of that confession was not made public until May 14, 1891, when Wheeler read it aloud in the packed courtroom. It was the first time most of Lincoln had heard the full account: the affair with Mary, the offer of $20,000, the 2 failed shooting attempts in December, the purchase of the cane, the attack on January 11th, and finally, the cup of coffee and the sleeping powder dissolved in it. The courtroom, by all accounts, was very quiet. McFarland had already withdrawn every word of it. He pled not guilty. The confession, he said, had been made under direct threat of violence. That was not a confession. That was survival. Judge Allen Field would later instruct the jury on this point with unusual clarity. Whatever they thought of McFarland's confession, they were not to use it as evidence against Mary Sheety. The law required that co-defendants be judged on their own evidence. A statement made by one man in a jail cell under threat could not convict another person who had not been present. This instruction would prove decisive. The trial of Mary Sheedy and Monday McFarland opened on May 4, 1891. Both sides had agreed to try them together. The defense believed the combined evidence would weaken the prosecution's case. The prosecution knew that trying them together was the only way to introduce McFarland's confession at all. Finding 12 impartial jurors in Lincoln, Nebraska in the spring of 1891 proved nearly impossible. The case had been front-page news for 4 months. The city's newspapers had taken sides. Neighbors had opinions. Men who had never met John Sheedy had formed settled views about whether his wife had killed him. The court reviewed 216 potential jurors before arriving at 12. During that process, one candidate, a man named A.B. Norton from the small town of Davie, was removed from the panel after it emerged that he had been telling his neighbors he had already made up his mind. Both were guilty, he reportedly said. And then, revising his judgment, he told others she would go free and McFarland would hang. Norton was charged with perjury for lying about his impartiality during the selection process. The words attributed to him were not subtle, and they were not, in Lincoln in 1891, unusual. The case had exposed fault lines that the city's booster ethos had papered over for years. That ethos rested on a faith in growth, respectability, and progress. What the trial put on display was something else. A white woman of questionable background and a black man who cut her hair, accused together of murdering the man who had bought off the police and sold illegal gambling to the mayor. The trial was not simply about who killed John Sheedy. It was about what Lincoln was and what it wanted to believe it wasn't. The jury was finally seated on May 11th. The trial proper lasted another 18 days. The prosecution entered the trial with what seemed, on its surface, like a strong hand. A detailed confession naming both defendants, a clear financial motive, and a widow who had been in the room when her husband died. By the end of May, each of those elements had been seriously damaged. The poison, as already established, was not there. 2 separate laboratory analyses, in Ann Arbor and in Chicago, had found nothing. The prosecution continued to argue the poisoning theory regardless, but the physical evidence contradicted it. The first doctor called to testify stated plainly that Sheedy had died of brain compression from the blow to the head. The confession was contested on grounds of coercion. Multiple witnesses described a detective who had threatened a prisoner with mob violence to obtain a statement. The confession had been recorded in secret by a man hiding behind a curtain. When McFarland himself took the position that the statement had been forced from him, the defense had substantial supporting testimony. And then there was the judicial instruction. Even if the jury believed every word of the confession, even if they thought McFarland had told the exact truth in that jail cell, they could not use it to convict Mary Sheedy. The judge had made that explicit. Without the confession, the case against her rested almost entirely on circumstance. She had been present. She had brought the coffee. She stood to inherit. The defense countered with its own theory of the case. Attorney Jesse Strode argued in his closing that Dennis Sheedy and John Fitzgerald had orchestrated the prosecution with one purpose: to prove Mary guilty and take the estate. Detective Malone, he said, had been motivated by reward money offered by Dennis Sheedy. The entire apparatus of the investigation had been assembled not to find the truth, but to produce a particular outcome. Neither side had a clean answer to the central question. On May 29, 1891, shortly after 3:30 in the afternoon, the jury returned. The courtroom on the second floor of the Lancaster County Courthouse was filled beyond capacity. People stood in the doorway and out into the corridor. The county clerk read the verdict aloud. Monday McFarland, not guilty on all counts. Mary Sheety, not guilty on all counts. The room erupted. Cheers came from one section. Hisses came from another. Both sounds filled the same space at the same time, which was, in its way, the most accurate summary of Lincoln, Nebraska's feelings about this case that anyone had yet produced. Mary Sheety and Monday McFarland were released from custody. They walked out of the Lancaster County Courthouse into the spring afternoon. They did not, as far as the record shows, speak to each other again. Monday McFarland left Lincoln shortly after the trial. He disappears from the historical record almost immediately. No address, no occupation, no further mention in the Nebraska newspapers that had covered his case for 5 months. A man who had been at the center of one of the most discussed criminal trials in the state's history simply ceased to be newsworthy. Mary Sheety remained in Lincoln for another year. In 1892, she married a salesman named Max Burst and moved to San Francisco. In 1893, she filed suit against John Sheedy's estate, now administered by Dennis Sheety, for a larger monthly allowance. The suit failed. The estate, worth $200,000 at the time of John Sheedy's death, remained under Dennis Sheedy's administration. John Fitzgerald, the reform politician who had spent years trying to shut down John Sheedy's casino, served as co-administrator alongside him. The two men who had argued most loudly that Mary Sheety was a murderer ended up in control of the money that her conviction would have transferred to them. The jury had said she wasn't guilty. That was not the same as saying she hadn't done it, and it was emphatically not the same as saying the men who prosecuted her had been acting in good faith.